Carbon nanotubes were studied in some detail starting in the 1990s. They actually were discovered back in 1950s, but the first discovery, just like what I said about graphene, which was discovered in the beginning 1960, very early 1960s, carbon nanotubes were discovered in Russia and were not followed up there. And they were independently discovered in the early 1970s by a number of groups, and kind of almost independently. The earliest real work, serious work, was in Japan, and that was in the group by Endo and Shinshu University, which is not a mainstream university, or wasn't at that time, and so people didn't really know about that work very much. I met Endo for the first time at the time he attended the first international conference, so that was much later, and that was in 1980. And that was a conference, was the second international conference on intercalation compounds. And he spoke about what he was doing with carbon fibers. And I was very much taken with carbon fibers because they seem like the perfect medium to explore transport. You could make a sample that had just the right kind of shape, long and skinny. And so that seemed like the way to go for doing transport measurements. So I teamed up with him, and we worked on transport measurements and then intercalation and all kinds of things for quite a while. But the focus with him was always on the carbon fiber business, and we made fibers smaller and smaller and smaller. And in 1977, there was a conference in Japan, and the conference was in the Japanese language. And I believe there were no foreign people at this conference, non-Japanese, because it was at a resort somewhere far from the centers where Western people journeyed in the 1970s. So, and there, Kubo, who was a very famous Japanese theorist, asked Endo the question, and this is a historic question because I found out about it very soon thereafter from Endo when I met him, was how small, how thin can you make a carbon fiber? Would it be possible to make a carbon fiber that was just one layer thick? And that was the concept of the single wall nanotube. And this idea sort of settled in my mind. And speaking of Japanese, I had two Japanese visitors that visited me in 1991. And they came looking for some projects to do. So they were Fujita-san and Saito-san. They were both very young people. They had had faculty positions for maybe 3 or 4 years, and they were on their first leave to learn new things. And somehow they both wound up at MIT. They didn't know each other, and somehow both approached me at the same time. And by happenstance, I gave the two of them at the same time the same project to work on together because they were very different. One was more sort of geometrical and the other one was more analytic. And I thought that that would be good for this kind of a project. So they worked together, and very soon they came up with the idea that a carbon nanotube would be something very interesting because it could either be metallic or semiconducting. When we published this very first paper back in 1992, people didn't believe that any single material could be either semiconducting or metallic, depending on how you oriented the hexagon forming the 6 fundamental atoms in the unit cell with respect to the axis of the cylinder that was formed when you made a nanotube. So this was something that people just couldn't comprehend, and it took 6 years before people believed that our paper was correct.